Supposed to graduate on a Saturday, cap pressed flat against her locks, dissertation submitted, mother crying happy tears outside the exam hall. That was how it was supposed to go. That was the plan. Instead, she died on a Tuesday. Hit by a delivery van outside a convenience store, a bottle of orange juice in her hand, her earphones still playing a podcast about medicinal root compounds. 21 years old. Top of her class. Gone. And then she woke up somewhere else entirely. In someone else's body. In someone else's agony. In the middle of the worst night of someone else's ruined life. And the baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Pain was the first thing she understood. Not thought. Not memory. Not even the bewildering fact of existence. Just pain. Enormous and animal. Ripping through a body she did not recognize as her own. It started at the base of her spine and crested like a wave that had been gathering force for 9 months. And it broke over her with all the mercy of a stone wall. She screamed. The sound that came out was not hers. It was rougher, rawer, a girl's voice that had already been screaming for hours. Her throat ached with the friction of it. Her hands, these unfamiliar hands, fingers longer than she remembered, nails broke into the quick, clawed at the edge of a wooden cot, and the cot groaned beneath her weight. The room was dark. That was the second thing she understood, not the comfortable dark of a power cut or a blacked-out bedroom. Ancient dark, the kind of dark that existed before electricity had ever been imagined. Broken only by a single tallow candle guttering on a shelf that held nothing else but a rusted tin cup and a leather pouch she could not yet reach. The air was thick and sweltering, smelling of old straw and the copper tang of blood. She gasped through the contraction, riding it the way she had once, in another life, a life she was already being pulled away from, ridden a wave at the coast, leaning into the force of it, because fighting would only drown her. She had read enough. She knew enough. Breathe. Don't push yet. Breathe. The contraction passed and she collapsed back against the cot, panting, soaked in a slick, feverish sweat that was not her sweat, in a body that was not her body, in a world she could not yet name. It took her exactly 4 contractions to stop trying to make sense of it. Sense could wait. The baby could not. She had delivered lambs with her uncle the summer she turned 16, in the village outside Accra, where her grandmother lived. She had assisted a local healer with a difficult birth, a goat, but still. And she had read everything her phytomedicine program offered on traditional obstetric practices across 17 cultures. None of that made her a midwife, but it was more than the girl whose body she now occupied had. She assessed what she had. A cot. A thin straw mattress, damp. A candle. A rough wool blanket, too small. A tin cup, empty. A leather pouch on the shelf. She reached for it between contractions, fingers clumsy and shaking. Heavy. She loosened the cord with her teeth and spilled the contents into her palm. Gold coins. A dozen of them, perhaps more. And something else. A small object wrapped in cloth and tied with rough twine. She did not have time to examine it. The next contraction arrived like a boot to the spine and she dropped everything, coins scattering across the floor with a sound like small broken bells, and she gripped the cot and breathed and bore it. The birth took another 2 hours. She did not know the girl whose body this was. She did not know her name yet, or her story, or what had broken her so completely that she had been alone on what should have been the most witnessed night of her life. But she felt it, in the marrow of borrowed bones, in the trembling of borrowed hands, that this girl had been loved once, badly, and had paid for it in ways that were only just becoming clear. When the baby finally came, it came all at once, a rush, a mess, a sound that was half rage and half astonishment at being forced out of the dark into the cold. She caught him. Of course it was a him. She did not know how she knew. She just did. She bit the cord with her teeth the way she had seen done once in a documentary she had half-watched while studying for an exam she could no longer remember the subject of. She tied it off with the twine from the pouch. She wrapped the baby in the smallest piece of her own dress she could tear free without leaving herself indecent, and she held him against her chest, and he screamed his outrage at the world, and she, in a body that had just done something extraordinary, in a life that was not hers, started to cry. Not from joy. Not from grief, from the sheer bewildering weight of still being alive at all. The memories came in pieces, not like a vision, more like the way dreams bleed into waking, present without explanation, already fading at the edges. A name, Alita. A village, the kind with one square, one baker, who knew everyone's business before it happened. Red soil roads. Thatched roofs, a market that ran on Tuesdays and on gossip. A father, a shopkeeper with careful hands and a careful reputation, a man who weighed his words the same way he weighed his grain, precisely, not generously. And a boy, She saw him in fragments, the way sunlight cuts through water. Never the whole picture, just pieces of it. Dark eyes. Wide shoulders even at 19, not from wealth but from work. A laugh that was surprised out of him rather than offered freely. A hut at the edge of the village, half hidden by the tree line, where the other children had dared each other to knock on the door and run. Where she had not run. She felt the heat in the memory that was not hers but belonged to this body completely. The particular heavy heat of a girl who knew she was doing something she should not, and did it anyway, again and again for 3 years. The heat of skin against skin in a room with a banked fire. The weight of his hands that she had trusted more than she admitted. The sensation of a laugh pressed against her collarbone in the dark. The scent of pine and hard labor clinging to him. She pulled away from it, blinking. Not mine. Those aren't my memories, but they were all she had. She sorted through them, clinical as she could manage, with a newborn against her chest and a dying candle, and the slow dawning comprehension that she was not going back. Because she remembered dying too. The van. The orange juice. The podcast still playing as the road came up to meet her. The blinding, total moment of impact. And then this. She was dead on Earth. That girl was gone. The body she had been born into was gone. And Alita. This Alita, the one whose bones she now wore, whose memories seeped into her like water through cracked stone, was gone too. She had died here, in this hut, in this labor, alone and abandoned, and not yet 20 years old. 2 women dead on the same night. And one left standing. She sat up properly for the first time, back aching enormously, and looked around the hut in the candle's last guttering light. Small. 1 room. A hearth that had not been lit in days. She could tell by the gray cold ash, undisturbed. A shelf. The cot. A battered chest in the corner, padlocked shut. She had a flash of memory, the key on a cord around the original Alita's neck. And she reached up with a trembling hand and found it there, a small iron thing warm from her skin. On the shelf beside the dying candle, a clay pot with a cracked lid. She could smell it from here, something preserved, something with salt and fat. Her stomach contracted with hunger so sharp, it was indistinguishable from nausea. She had a baby. She had a cracked pot of preserved something. She had a pouch full of gold coins scattered across a dirt floor. And she had knowledge. The knowledge of a woman from a century and a world away, packed into her skull alongside another woman's grief. All right, she said softly, to the baby, to the dark, to whatever strange architecture of fate had landed her here. Let's figure out what we're working with. She found everything by the time the candle died, and she had to work by the thin gray light pressing through the shuttered window. The chest held 2 wool blankets, worn but whole. A change of clothes that had belonged to a man. They would hang off her, but they were clean. A small knife with a good edge, and a bundle of dried herbs tied with grass. She lifted the bundle to her nose and went very still. Meadowsweet. Yarrow. Something she could not name in any language this world used, but which she knew by sight and smell as an anti-inflammatory. Good for fever, good for pain, good for a body that had just done what hers had done. Someone had lived here, who knew what they were doing with plants. She thought of the boy in the borrowed memories, the boy who had been alone in this hut from the age of 13, after his father died and left him nothing but walls and a reputation he had not earned, who had apparently spent those years learning things, while the village watched from a distance and found him lacking. She set the herbs aside with care. The coin pouch, once she gathered every piece from the floor, held 14 gold coins and 7 smaller silver ones. She did not know this economy yet, did not know what a gold piece bought or what a working woman could earn in a week, but the memories told her enough. 14 gold coins was not nothing. It was the kind of sum a man saved for years toward a specific and serious purpose. The dowry, something in her chest said quietly, not her own thought. She closed the pouch and held it in both hands. He had saved for a dowry. He had offered it. And she, the first Alita, the one who had stood in the market square and laughed with her friends and called him a good screw, a secret, something to be scraped off her shoes before she married a banker's son, had shrugged it off, had looked him in the eye and told him the timing wasn't right, knowing full well she was already being promised to someone else. And then she had gone back to the square and laughed about his eyes following her. And he had been standing close enough to hear every word. She felt sick with it, this borrowed guilt, this grief that did not belong to her. Then she steadied. Not your sin, she told herself firmly. Not your guilt to carry. But your life now. His son. And his gold. She unwrapped the small object tied in cloth. It was a carved wooden disc, rough but deliberate. A circle of leaves around a center she could not make out in the dim light. The kind of thing a boy carves alone in a hut at the edge of the forest in the long years, when there is nothing else to do but learn the patience of your own hands. She wrapped it back up and tucked it inside her dress, next to her skin. She found water in a clay cistern outside the door, cold, but clean-smelling. She drank until her head cleared. She cleaned the baby with strips torn from the man's shirt, working with the careful efficiency of every lab she had ever worked in, methodical while her hands wanted to shake. He was healthy. Good color, good cry, good grip, when she put her finger against his palm and he seized it with the blind ferocity of the newborn. He had dark eyes. She could not tell much about their shade yet, and a scowl that seemed constitutionally his own. "You look like someone who's going to have opinions," she told him. He scowled more deeply. She felt, despite everything, the faintest pull of something that was almost a smile. By the time full morning arrived, she had eaten. The preserved pot held salted pork fat, rich and dense and better than nothing, nursed the baby with a great deal of awkward determination, and sat in the weak winter sunlight at the open door of the hut, with borrowed memories arranging themselves into something like a map. The original Alita had been in this hut for 3 months, kicked out at 7 months pregnant by a father who had his own reputation to protect, and a daughter who had, in his estimation, thrown it and everything he had built for her into the fire. Her mother had wept and followed his decision. Her friends had done what people in small villages have always done when one of their own falls. They had talked about it extensively, mourned it briefly, and moved on. One had sent bread. Once, she had moved into the hut because it was the only place that was hers by any logic. No rent owed. The village let her be, which was not the same as helping her. She had known the coins were there. She had not touched them. She had let herself and her pregnancy and this hut deteriorate, while 14 gold coins sat in a leather pouch like a verdict she refused to open. Because opening them would have meant admitting something. That he had loved her. That what she had called convenient, what she had laughed about in the square while he stood close enough to hear, it had been, for him, the entire reason he had stayed in a village that had never wanted him. And she had treated it like something shameful, something to rinse off. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she stood up. She was not that girl, but she was the woman who had to live with the aftermath. And she had never been the type to sit still in a mess and wait for someone else to clean it up. She picked up her son, settled the coin pouch inside her dress, and walked toward the village. The market square was already half alive when she arrived, traders setting out their wares with the practiced ease of people who had done this every Tuesday for years. Heads turned when they saw her. She watched the calculation happen in their faces. Recognition, then memory, then the particular coolness of people who have already decided what they think of you and see no reason to revisit it. She did not flinch. She had walked into lecture halls where the professor had already decided she was not serious. Into labs where the funding was thinner and the equipment older, because the work that interested her was not the work that interested the people who held the money. She had walked into spaces that were not built to hold her, and she had made them hold her anyway. She bought provisions with 2 silver coins, dried grain, salt, a small hard cheese, a bundle of fresh herbs she examined so carefully that the seller, an old woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, frowned at her. "You know your plants," the old woman said. It was not a compliment. It was a probe. "Meadowsweet for fever," she replied without looking up from the bundle. "Yarrow's been cut too early this batch. You'll want to speak to your supplier. And this," she set a sprig aside. "This is chickweed, not what you've labeled it. Harmless enough. But harmless isn't the same as useful." A beat of silence. "You're the shopkeeper's daughter." The old woman's voice had shifted. Not warm, but recalibrated. "Thought you only knew how to pick mushrooms near the outcast's wood." She met the woman's eyes. "I know more than that," she said quietly. "I just hadn't needed to show it yet." She paid, tucked the provisions under her arm, and walked back through the square with her head level and her son asleep against her chest. She heard the whispers start up behind her the way she always heard them, the specific frequency of people who want to be overheard and have miscalculated who they are dealing with. She let them talk. She was already thinking about the capital. This village knew what it knew about Alita, and what it knew would never stop being the ceiling of what it would allow her to become. But a capital city was full of strangers. And strangers, she had always found, were so much easier to surprise. That night, with her son fed and sleeping and the hearth finally lit, she had found flint and steel in the chest. Of course she had. He was a man who would have had flint and steel. She sat by the fire and unwrapped the cloth disc again. In the firelight, she could see what she had missed in the gray morning. The center of the carved circle was not blank. It was a single letter, small and deliberate, T for Thorn. Or perhaps for a boy who had spent years being told he was nothing, who had carved his initial into the heart of a circle of leaves because it was the only way of saying, "I was here. I existed. I mattered, in some small and private way, even if no one agreed." She held it for a long time. She did not know him. She held his son and lived in his house and spent his coins, but she did not know him. The boy in the borrowed memories was not a person she had access to, just impressions. Heat. A laugh surprised out of him. Wide shoulders. Dark eyes that had, apparently, always found Alita across a crowded square. He had joined the army. He had left. He was somewhere on the other side of a war she had only the vaguest outlines of, and for all she knew he was dead in a field somewhere, his coins spent by a woman he did not know existed, and his son named by a stranger wearing his first love's face. She wrapped the disc back up and pressed it against her sternum. She looked at her son. His scowl, his dark eyes, the set of his jaw that she was already beginning to recognize as something inherited and immovable. "Your father left us gold and a piece of carved wood," she told him. "We are going to do a great deal better than that." He slept through this, with the imperious indifference of the very young. She smiled, small, private, entirely her own, and began to plan. The first year was the hardest. She would not pretend otherwise. She had knowledge, deep, specific, hard-earned knowledge, the kind that had cost her 4 years of undergraduate study and a dissertation she had defended in front of a panel of academics who had spent 40 years forgetting more than she would ever know. She could identify 300 medicinal plants by sight, smell, and touch. She could speak fluently about alkaloid compounds, about anti-inflammatory pathways, about the intersection of traditional herbal practice and modern pharmacological understanding. None of that translated cleanly into a medieval economy where the accepted medical authority was a man called the village healer who had inherited the title from his father and whose primary diagnostic tool was his own confidence. She had to learn to work with what this world had. And what this world had, it turned out, was extraordinary. The forest beyond Thorne's hut, her hut now, she had started thinking of it that way with a quiet, guilty pragmatism, was dense with things she recognized and things she did not, and the things she did not recognize became her obsession. She mapped them. She tested them with the careful, systematic patience she had developed in labs that smelled of clean plastic and fluorescent light, adapted now for a room that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. She kept notes in a system of symbols she invented herself, because the written language here was not one she had come to this body knowing, and learning it had to happen simultaneously with everything else. The baby. She named him Ren, for no reason she could logically explain except that it was short and strong and felt right in her mouth, slept strapped to her back in a length of cloth she had fashioned from one of the man's shirts. She could feel the damp heat of his breath against her neck and the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart against her spine as she moved through the undergrowth. He watched the forest ceiling above her with the wide, unblinking curiosity of an infant, discovering that the world was very large and very interesting. "This one," she would tell him, crouching beside a low-growing cluster of dark leaves, her fingers tracing the veins of the plant with a scholar's reverence, "is similar to what my world calls self-heal, Prunella vulgaris. Antibacterial. Wound healing. Anti-inflammatory." She touched the leaves with 2 fingers, the contact grounding her. "We'll call it something else here. We'll figure that out." Ren would stare at the leaves with enormous gravity, as though he was taking notes. She talked to him constantly, not in the cooing, simplified register that some instinct suggested, but normally, informatively, the way she had always processed things best, out loud with precision. He was an excellent audience. He never interrupted, and his attention was absolute. The village had opinions about her from the start, and the opinions were not flattering. They saw a disgraced girl who had gotten herself with child by an outcast, and now wandered the forest gathering weeds. They saw someone whose beauty, and the body she wore was genuinely beautiful, with high cheekbones, dark, soulful eyes, and a mouth that she had not yet learned to be comfortable with, whose beauty had been her only currency, and had bought her nothing in the end. They saw the shopkeeper's ruined daughter. They expected her to fail quietly, and eventually go back to begging her father's forgiveness. The first time she saved someone's life in the village, it was an accident. A child, 5 years old, the butcher's youngest, had gotten into a patch of something toxic in the field behind the market. The healer had prescribed a purge and gone home to his dinner. She had been walking past with Ren on her back when she heard the mother's crying and recognized the particular jagged pitch of it. She went inside without being invited. She was 3 minutes and 1 correctly identified plant compound later when she had the child stabilized and the mother staring at her across the cot like she was something that could not be categorized. "How did you know that?" the mother whispered. "I studied it," she said simply. "A long time ago, in a different place." The healer did not speak to her for a month after that. The butcher's wife told everyone she met. The village, predictably, split directly down the middle between those who believed in results and those who believed in knowing your place, which was a less even split than it might have appeared, because most of the people who cared about results were women, And women in this village were a significant majority of the people who actually dealt with illness, with birth, with the daily management of bodies and their failures. She built her first clients one at a time. Quietly. Without announcement. She did not compete with the healer directly. She went around him, into the spaces he found beneath his notice. Women's health. Children, the elderly who couldn't afford his fees. She charged less. She explained more. She came back to check. Trust is built in very small increments, and lost in very large ones. She had learned that in the original Alita's memories. In the reverse, she was determined to build it the right way, but she had always known the village had a ceiling, and she hit it hard in the second year. It was a man called Darren. Darren was a landowner, moderately powerful by village standards, which meant that what he said carried weight in proportion to his acreage. He had a wife with a recurring chest complaint that the healer had been managing, unsuccessfully, for 3 years. She had approached Alita in private, nervous and apologetic, and Alita had examined her and recognized the symptoms with a familiarity that almost made her laugh out loud. A chronic inflammatory condition, manageable with the right compounds, none of which were in the healer's repertoire. She treated her. It worked. Within 6 weeks, the woman was better than she had been in years. Darren did not come to thank her. Darren came to tell her that what she was doing was dangerous, that she had no authority, that the healer had expressed concerns, and that a woman of her reputation and circumstances ought to be more careful about reaching above herself. She listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and Ren asleep behind her in his cot. When he was finished, she said, "Your wife can breathe without pain for the first time in 3 years." Darren said, "That's not the point." She looked at him for a long, level moment. "I know," she said quietly. "That's the problem." He left. She sat very still for a long time after he was gone. Then she looked at her sleeping son, 14 months old, beginning to pull himself upright against every surface he could reach, furious and determined, and entirely himself. And she thought, not here. This place is not the ceiling. It is just a wall. She started preparing to leave the following week. The decision to go to the capital was practical, not romantic. She had 2 years' worth of saved coins by then. She had been careful, boringly careful, with the gold Thorn had left, supplemented by modest earnings from her practice. She had a body of knowledge she had spent 2 years systematically expanding and documenting. She had a system of remedies she had tested and refined. And she had a son who was learning to walk in a village that would always see his parentage before it saw him. She was not going to let that happen. She packed what she could carry, sold the few things she could not, locked the hut with the iron key on its cord. She kept it, though she could not have explained why, some stubborn instinct of some day, and walked out of the village on a Thursday morning before the market set up. Only the butcher's wife saw her go. The woman pressed a package of cured meat into her hands without speaking, and held her gaze for a moment, with something that was as close to respect as the village had ever managed. "Don't let them make you small," the woman said. "They didn't manage it here," she said. "They won't manage it there either." The city was called Varenhem, and it was enormous. She stood at the edge of it with Ren on her hip and her pack on her back and felt, for the first time since she had woken up in that hut, something very close to joy. She was a person without a past here. No father who had thrown her out. No healer with territory to protect. No landowner measuring the distance between her origins and her ambitions. Just streets, and people moving through them with the focused indifference of city dwellers everywhere and in every century. The universal language of people who have somewhere to be, and no particular interest in your business. She found a room above a tanner's workshop. Cheap, because the smell was significant, but clean and structurally sound and equipped with a window large enough to grow things on the sill. She grew things on the sill from the first week. Ren watched the seedlings with the same grave attention he had given the forest floor. She talked to them and to him simultaneously, and the tanner's wife, who came up to investigate the smell of something cooking that was not food, stood in the doorway for a long moment and then said, "You're an herb woman." "I am," she said. "My husband has a knee that hasn't bent properly in 2 years." She looked at the woman. "Tell him to come up tomorrow morning. Before the workshop opens." The tanner's knee bent correctly within 3 weeks. The tanner's wife told her friends. The first friend became a client. The first client told 2 more. The 2 more told 3 each. She did not advertise. She did not need to. In a city full of people and a medical establishment that served primarily those who could afford its most expensive practitioners, there was an enormous appetite, hungry, chronic, frustrated, for someone competent who would look at you, listen to you, and actually explain what was happening in your own body. She gave them that. It was not complicated. It was simply rarer than it should have been. By the end of the first year in Varenhem, she had moved to better rooms, 2 of them now, one to sleep and one to work, in a quieter quarter of the city, with a proper workbench and drying racks along 2 walls and a small, fiercely organized storage system that Ren was forbidden to touch and touched constantly. "This one," she would say, catching his hand for the 14th time that morning. "What is it?" he would ask, because he had started talking at 14 months and had not stopped since, a fact which she took some private credit for. "St. John's wort, or what this world calls sunthread. It's for people whose minds go dark." Ren would consider this. "Like when I'm sad." "Yes. But a deeper sad than yours, love. A sad that doesn't go away on its own." He would nod very seriously, and then attempt to touch something else. She had fashioned their life with her own 2 hands, and it was a good life, a real one, anchored in purpose and populated with small daily joys. The smell of a remedy that had come together correctly. The particular satisfaction of a client who returned not because they were sick, but because they wanted to learn. The way Ren laughed when she got something wrong, and the way he slept, deeply and without fear, every single night. She was, she thought, happy. Not the happiness of her old life, which had been lighter and less earned. Something weightier, something she had built on ground. She had cleared herself. Ren at 4 years old was a problem, in the best possible way. He was clever the way that becomes exhausting around the 3rd year. Not the placid, receptive cleverness of a child who absorbs information, but the active, relentless cleverness of a child who interrogates it. He wanted to know why. He wanted to know what happened next. He wanted to know if there was another way, a different approach, a better answer, and he would sit with a question until it yielded, rather than accept an approximation of an answer just because it was easier. She recognized it. She had been told, in her old life, that she asked too many questions. That it slowed things down. That sometimes the established answer was the answer, and there was no productive reason to keep pulling at it. She had not believed that then. She did not believe it now. "You're going to be extraordinary," she told him one evening, watching him frown over a dried root she had given him to examine, turning it in his small hands with intense concentration. "What is it?" he said, not looking up. "You tell me. You've been looking at it for 10 minutes. He turned it once more. "It smells bitter, like the other bitter ones, the ones for belly pain. But different. More." He searched for the word. "Sharp?" She looked at him with her whole chest going quiet. "Gentian," she said softly. "You're right. Different from the others. Good for digestion, but also..." She paused. "Also, we use it for people who have lost their appetite for living. Not just food. Everything." Ren looked at the root with new gravity. "That's a lot of work for one plant," he said. She laughed. She laughed properly, unexpectedly. The kind of laugh that comes from a place too deep and too genuine to be managed. "Yes," she said. "It is. There were nights, though. There were nights when Ren was asleep, and the city was quiet outside, and she sat at her workbench with her hands still, and her mind moving in directions she had spent years redirecting. Nights when she pulled out the wooden disc and sat with it in her palm, and let herself think about the man it had belonged to. She knew more about him now than she had in the beginning. The borrowed memories had settled and stratified over 5 years, becoming something more like knowledge than intrusion. She knew the shape of him, not just the physical shape, but the interior one. The particular combination of self-sufficiency and loneliness. The pride that never became arrogance, because he had never had enough social capital for arrogance to attach to. The decision to join the army that had not really been a decision so much as the only motion available when the ground beneath him had given way. She knew he had overheard. She had known from the beginning that he had overheard. The memory of the square was one of the original Alita's clearest, perhaps because it was the moment everything had cracked. But 5 years of sitting with it had given her a bone-deep understanding of what it had meant to him. Not just the humiliation. The confirmation. The specific cruelty of having something you had privately feared. "She is ashamed of me. This was never what I thought it was," said out loud in a public place for other people to laugh at. She felt the heat of that shared past blooming in her skin, a phantom sensation of skin against skin in a room with a banked fire. It was the heat of hands she had trusted, and a laugh pressed against her collarbone in the dark. She had not done that, but she lived in the body that had. She had decided, somewhere in the 2nd year, that she could not carry guilt for it. The guilt would eat her and serve no one. But she could carry the knowledge. She could let it make her careful, in the way that knowledge of something broken makes you careful with what you hold. On the nights she took out the disc, she did not feel guilty. She felt something more complicated, something that had taken 5 years to name, and which she still was not entirely sure she had named correctly. "I would like to meet him," she thought, finally, turning the disc over. The real him, not the memory, not the shape of a man I know secondhand through someone else's wanting. I would like to meet him and see what he became. It was an idle thought. He was a foot soldier somewhere far away, on the wrong end of a war she knew nothing about. The odds that he had survived were not good. The odds that she would ever see him again were. She put the disc away. She went to bed. She did not let herself finish the calculation. The rumors arrived ahead of the army by about 3 weeks. She heard them in the market. She went every week now, partly for supplies and partly because the market was where the city's information circulated before it hardened into established fact. Verenhem's market was the best she had found for both. "The army is coming back," said the grain seller, to no one in particular, and everyone within earshot. Pushed the barbarian line back past the ridge. "The generals called it." "Not the old general," someone corrected. "He died 2 years back. The young one took it." "Bolton, they call him." "Bolton," the grain seller repeated, rolling the name. "Soldier's son?" "Adopted. Old General Bolton took him on, made him an officer. When the general died, he left him the command." She was examining a bundle of dried bark at the time. She did not look up. "They say he's brutal," someone else offered. A woman, low-voiced. The kind of voice that was not certain whether it was horrified or admiring. "Brilliant tactician but brutal. Doesn't lose men unless he has to, but he doesn't hesitate either." "He's young," the first woman said. "For a general, 26. She looked up. 26. A foot soldier who had joined at 21, 5 years ago, from a village that was sending a recruiting party through. Who would be 26 now, if he had survived. Who had been adopted by a general and given a new name. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was proud of that. She paid for the bark, collected Ren from where he was crouching nearby, examining a puddle with scientific intensity, and walked home through streets that felt, suddenly, very different from how they had felt an hour ago. She did not know it was him. She told herself this, firmly and repeatedly, over the following weeks as the city began to prepare for the army's return. Bolton was not an uncommon name to take. Adoptions happened. Foot soldiers became officers when they were good enough. 26 was young for a general, but not impossible. The numbers lined up, but numbers lined up all the time and meant nothing. She believed none of this, which was exactly why she repeated it. She kept working. She kept her head down. She treated a merchant's wife with persistent headaches and a dockworker's infected hand, and a little girl whose mother had carried her across the city because she had heard there was an herb woman who explained things, and the little girl was afraid of healers who didn't explain. She was known, now. Not famous. She was careful about the difference, but known, with the warm specificity of a city that has found something reliable and keeps returning to it. The herb woman in the weaver's quarter. The one with the child who asks questions. The one who fixed Tamsin's knee. The one who looks at you like she actually intends to solve the problem. It was a reputation she had built with her hands and her mind, and 5 years of showing up consistently. It was hers, fully and entirely, untainted by the original Alita's history, because no one in this city had known the original Alita. It was, she thought, enough. And then the letter came. It was delivered by an army adjutant in a green cloak, official, formal, with the seal of General Bolton's command pressed into the wax. She turned it over twice before she opened it, noting the quality of the paper, the precision of the seal, the handwriting on the outside that was neither soldier rough nor bureaucrat smooth, but something in between. Someone who had taught himself to write correctly later than most. She had seen that handwriting once before, in a different context, in a different century, on a piece of cloth wrapped around a carved wooden disc. She opened it anyway. The letter was brief. General Bolton's army required a medical officer with plant and remedy expertise for the next campaign. Her name had been given by 3 independent sources as the most skilled herbalist in Verenhem. The posting would be paid, properly, more than she currently earned. Would she come for an assessment? She read it twice. Then she looked at Ren, who was watching her face with the focused attention he gave anything he suspected was significant. "Is it important?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good important or bad important?" She thought about it. She thought about the carved disc in her drawer, about the 14 gold coins that had become everything she now had, about a girl who had died in labor, and a man who had joined an army because the ground had given way, and the little boy who had his father's eyes, and her own determination, and absolutely no idea yet how large his life was going to be. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She set the letter down. She picked it back up. She read it a 3rd time. Then she wrote back. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." She almost talked herself out of it 4 times on the walkover. Not from fear. She had made a reasonably thorough peace with fear in the first year of this life, when fear had been a daily companion and indulging it had not been an option. It was something more specific than fear. Something that lived in the space between what she knew intellectually and what her body understood viscerally, which was that she was walking into a room that might contain a man whose life had been irrevocably shaped by a version of her that she had never been. She had worn the original Alita's face for 5 years. She had long since stopped feeling like a trespasser in it. It was hers now, in every practical sense, worn into something that was neither the first Alita nor the woman she had been on Earth, but a third thing entirely, a person built from the collision of both. But she was aware, acutely, that to anyone who had known the original Alita, she would look like a ghost. And there was one person in this city who had known the original Alita better than anyone. You don't know it's him, she told herself, for the last time, as the adjutant led her through the camp's outer perimeter. The army was quartered in the wide field to the east of Villainous, a temporary arrangement, the adjutant had explained, while logistics were managed and the men were rested before dispersal. It was organized with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a command that did not tolerate disorder. Rows of tents in precise lines, supply wagons arranged by function. A medical quarter that she assessed with a professional eye as she passed. Adequate, she thought. Functional, but not innovative. The kind of setup designed by someone who had read about medicine, rather than practiced it. She noted the gaps. It was automatic. The command tent was larger than the others, set slightly apart, with 2 soldiers at the entrance who looked at her with the particular blankness of men trained to reveal nothing. The adjutant spoke to them quietly. One ducked inside. A pause. Then he held the flap open and gestured her through. She straightened her back, settled Ren's carved disc where she always kept it against her sternum, and walked in. The tent was simply furnished for a general's quarters. A large table covered in maps, a camp chair, a stand of weapons along one wall that were clearly functional rather than decorative, a small brazier in the corner doing honest work against the autumn chill. Lanterns hung at precise intervals. Everything in its place, nothing wasted. The man standing at the map table had his back to her. He was taller than she had expected, which was irrational, because she had the original Alita's memories of him, and she knew exactly how tall he was. But memory is a flat thing, and the body in front of her was not flat. It was real and present, and carrying 5 years of war across the set of its shoulders, in a way no memory could have prepared her for. He was broad now in a way that had nothing to do with youth. His hair was shorter than it had been. There was a scar along the back of his left forearm that she could see from where she stood, pale against dark skin, old enough to have settled into permanence. He was studying the map with the focused stillness of someone for whom concentration was not an effort, but a default state. She stood quietly and waited. After a moment, without looking up, he said, "The assessment is straightforward. I'll tell you what I need, you'll tell me what you can provide, and we'll determine if there's a match." "I don't require ceremony." "Neither do I," she said. He went still. Not the stillness of concentration. Something different. Something that moved through the set of his shoulders like a current through water, there and then controlled and then gone, so quickly that if she had not been watching for it, she would have missed it entirely. He turned around. Later, much later, in the specific privacy of 3 a.m. when the mind produces its truest assessments, she would try to describe to herself what it was like to see his face for the first time. She had the original Alita's memories of him. She had 5 years of sitting with those memories, turning them over, building an interior image of who he was from the fragment she had been given. She had thought she was prepared. She was not prepared, because the face in the memory had been a young man's face. Open, in the specific way that people are open before the world has done its work on them, not naive, but unguarded in the places where he had felt safe. And the face looking at her now was none of those things. It was harder. The jaw was the same. The dark eyes were the same. The particular set of the brow that she had come to recognize in Ren on a daily basis. All of it was the same. But it was as if someone had taken everything warm in the original and turned it to stone. Not to cruelty, not to coldness in the brittle, breakable sense. To something colder and more durable than that. Granite. The kind of cold that has been cold for long enough that it does not remember being anything else. He looked at her face, and something in those granite eyes moved. It was not joy. It was not warmth. It was the look of a man seeing something he had buried, standing upright in front of him, and finding that it did not have the decency to stay buried. "Alita," he said. It was not a greeting. It was the sound of a word being confirmed against expectation. A calculation completed. "General Bolton," she said. The silence lasted long enough to be a statement. She held it. She was very good at holding silences. It was a skill she had developed in lecture halls and consulting rooms, and 100 small power negotiations in market squares, and she understood its grammar precisely. The person who fills the silence first is not always the weaker one, but it is always the more revealing one. He filled it. "Sit," he said. Not ungraciously, but not warmly either. He gestured to the chair across the map table, and moved to the other side of it as she sat, putting the table between them with the deliberateness of a man who understood the tactical value of distance. She sat. She folded her hands on her knees. She waited. He looked at her for another moment. A flat, assessing look that she suspected had made seasoned soldiers uncomfortable, and which she met without difficulty. And then he opened a wooden case on the edge of the table and withdrew something she recognized immediately. He set it in front of her without comment. She looked at it. A dried root, sections of it, laid out in 3 pieces. Black-edged. One piece partially pulverized, the powder, a dull gray-green that was already telling her things. "What is it?" he said. She reached forward and picked up the largest piece. Brought it to her nose. Set it down and examined the powder. Rubbed a small amount between her fingers and brought them close to the lantern light. "Where did it come from?" she asked. "The medical stores. Brought up from the Southern Campaign. 3 men treated with it for fever who subsequently died. The attending healer attributed the deaths to the severity of the fever, not the treatment." She looked at the powder on her fingertips. "He was wrong. Tell me why." "This is southwort. It's used for fever management. That part is correct. But the root needs to be harvested before the 3rd week of flowering, or it develops a secondary compound here." She indicated the black edge on the cut surface. "That's cardiotoxic in the doses you'd use for fever treatment. Someone harvested this late. Probably didn't know the difference. The deaths weren't from the fever. They were from the treatment." A pause. "How do you identify the harvest timing now?" he said. "The plant is dried. The black edge is the accelerated decomposition of the toxic compound. It's unstable, which is fortunate, means it breaks down relatively quickly post-harvest. Fresh root from the same plant wouldn't show it. But these," she separated the 3 pieces with one finger, "these are also slightly tacky. Late harvest roots retain more moisture at the core. It's not conclusive on its own, but together with the discoloration, it's very clear." He was watching her hands. "You're certain?" he said. "Yes. The healer who administered it has been in this army for 8 years. She met his eyes. Then he's been wrong about this for 8 years and no one died from it until the Southern Campaign, where I would guess the local variants flower 2 weeks earlier than whatever region he was originally trained in." Something shifted fractionally in the granite face. Not warmth, more like the recalibration of a calculation whose variables had just been revised. He asked her 4 more questions. Each was harder than the last. Each was designed, she understood, not to test her knowledge, but to find its edges, to locate the point at which confidence became performance, where real expertise ran out and bluff began. She had spent her career in rooms full of men doing exactly this, and she had made a policy of 2 things: never bluff, and never apologize for knowing things. She did not bluff. She did not apologize. On the 4th question, she said, "I don't know the specific compound involved. I can tell you what I would test for, and what I would expect to find, but I'd want to examine the patient directly before I gave you a definitive answer." He looked at her. "Most people fill that gap with confidence they don't have. Most people are more afraid of appearing ignorant than of being wrong," she said. "The outcomes of those 2 fears are very different." Another silence. A different quality to it. "You'll take the position," he said. It was not a question. "That depends," she said, "on the terms." The terms were fair. She had expected them not to be, had prepared a negotiation, and was mildly wrong-footed when he named a salary that was more than she had asked for internally, and conditions that were more reasonable than the adjutant had implied. She agreed without haggling, because haggling when the offer is already correct is just performance, and she had established by this point that she did not perform for audiences who were not worth it. What she had not established, what she spent the following days carefully, quietly examining, was what the ice cost him. She had expected anger. She would have understood anger. The original Alita had earned it, richly and without ambiguity, and the face wearing the original Alita's features deserved to have it directed at her while she worked out how to explain the inexplicable. What she got instead was something more controlled and, in its way, more difficult. He was professional, impeccably, almost aggressively professional. He briefed her on the medical situation with precision and without waste. He answered her questions directly. He did not keep her waiting, and he did not create obstacles. He treated her, in every formal respect, as a valued appointment, and in every informal respect, he treated her like someone he had decided not to know. She had spent 5 years in a city building trust in increments, learning the texture of how people decided what they thought of you, and whether to revise it. She knew the difference between someone who was hostile and someone who had simply closed a door. Thorn, she thought of him as thorn in her own mind, was careful never to let it surface where he could hear it, had not closed a door so much as built a wall where the door had been, and painted it to match the surrounding architecture so that if you did not know to look for it, you would never find it. She knew to look for it. She did not push. She was patient in the way that 5 years of hard-won competence makes a person patient, not passively, not endlessly, but with the specific patience of someone who understands that some things cannot be rushed without being broken. But she watched. He was, she thought, extraordinary at his work. She had access now to the shape of how he commanded, and it was. She could not call it anything other than beautiful, in the way that any exceptionally well-executed thing is beautiful regardless of what it is. He did not shout. He did not perform authority. He made decisions with a speed that looked like instinct, and was actually the accumulated result of understanding every variable in the room before he was asked to choose between them. His men did not fear him, she noticed. They were careful with him. There was a watchfulness in how they occupied his presence, an attentiveness. But it was the watchfulness of people around someone whose standards are high and consistent, not someone whose moods are unpredictable. He was fair in the way that only people who have been treated unfairly understand fairness to mean, not equally, but correctly, according to what was actually deserved. She thought about the boy in the borrowed memories, who had grown up alone on the edge of a village that had never wanted him there, and she thought, he learned how to be this because he had no one to learn it from. He built it himself from scratch. The thought settled in her chest like something heavy and warm. She did not let it show on her face. It was an ordinary evening, 12 days into her posting. She was in the medical tent, cataloging the supply situation with the thoroughness that she had already discovered made the attending medics faintly nervous. Not because she found fault, but because she found things, specific and correctable things, that no one had looked closely enough to find before. She had a lamp, a logbook, and a cup of something the army called tea, that shared a name with the beverage and very little else. Ren was asleep in the small partition section she had negotiated for his use at the back of her tent. He had adapted to camp life with the serene flexibility of a child who had moved twice already and understood implicitly that home was a portable concept. She heard the tent flap. She did not look up. "The woman with the consumption in billet 7, said Thorne's voice. "You changed her treatment this morning." She set her pen down. "I did. The previous healer prescribed it. The previous healer prescribed rest and steam, which manages the symptoms without addressing the underlying infection. I added a compound that has a reasonable chance of clearing it." She paused. "I informed the previous healer of the change. He informed me. I assumed he would." She turned around. He was standing just inside the entrance, still in his day clothes, which meant he had come directly from something. A briefing, a meal, she did not know. He looked tired in the way that people who do not permit themselves to appear tired look when they have stopped calculating the performance. The granite was still there, but there was something underneath it that she could see now. A hairline seam, a place where the material was thinner than the rest. "You were right about the southward," he said. "I had our stores audited. 11 more units with late harvest indicators. Disposed of." "Good," she said. She waited. He looked at her. He was doing the thing she had noticed him do in the assessment, looking for the edges, the seams, the place where the surface became something else. It was less clinical now, more personal. The air in the small tent felt suddenly charged, the scent of wood smoke from his clothes mixing with the sharp, clean smell of dried herbs. The lamplight played across the hard planes of his face, making the golden brown of his eyes look molten. "You're not what I expected," he said. It came out differently than his usual statements, less decided, as though he had not fully resolved it himself before it arrived in the air between them. She considered her answer carefully. "I'm not what she expected either," she said. "The woman who used to live in this face. I don't think she knew what she was, toward the end." Something moved through the granite. Deep, like a tremor in bedrock. Felt more than visible. He took a step closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him. A physical presence that seemed to fill the small space. "That's a strange thing to say," he said. "I know." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, without inflection, "You knew Ren's father." She held very still. "Yes." "He left." "Yes." "Does Ren know about him?" She met his eyes. "I've told him that his father was a good man who left before he knew about Ren, that he went to do something important. That the leaving wasn't about Ren." Something in his expression changed in a way she could not fully read. Too many things moving at once, too quickly, across a face that had spent years learning not to be read. "That's generous," he said. His voice was careful. "Given the circumstances." "It's true," she said simply. He stood there for another moment. She could see him weighing something. Some decision about whether to step forward or retreat. Some calculation whose variables she did not have full access to. He retreated, professionally, gracefully, with no visible indication that retreating was what he was doing. "Carry on," he said, and left. She sat for a long time after the tent flap closed. The crack in the wall was small, barely visible. You would have to know to look for it. She knew to look for it. She understood, by then, that this was going to be complicated in every direction. It was going to be complicated because she was competent, and he respected competence and respect. For a man who had spent his life being denied it, was not a small thing. It was going to be complicated because she saw him clearly, not the version of him constructed from the original Alita's desire and guilt, but the actual person, the one he had made himself into, and clarity, she had learned, has a tendency to produce feelings that muddy it. It was going to be complicated because of Ren. She had watched, in the week since her arrival, the way Thorne's eyes moved to Ren when the boy was in the vicinity. Not with recognition. He had never seen Ren before, had not known Ren existed, but with something that looked, from a certain angle, like a man trying very hard not to notice something that his body was noticing without his permission. Ren at 4 years old was an undeniable argument. The jawline was Thorne's. The eyes were Thorne's. The way he stood with his feet slightly apart and his chin lifted when he was thinking. The way he turned toward difficulty instead of away from it. All of it. All of it. All of it. Thorne had not said anything. She had not said anything. The thing between them was accumulating nonetheless, the way debt accumulates. Quietly, without drama, in the dark when no one is watching, until the number becomes undeniable and something has to be paid. She was not afraid of the reckoning. She had been preparing for it, in her way, for 5 years. She sat at her workbench in the lamplight and took out the carved wooden disc and looked at the letter T worn smooth by years of handling, and she thought, he built himself from nothing. He walked through a war and came out the other side with his integrity intact and his people alive, and something that looks, from here, a great deal like honor. He deserves the truth. She put the disc away. She went to check on her son, who was asleep with the absolute totality of a child, who has nothing on his conscience, and everything still ahead of him. She stood at the edge of his sleep for a moment. I'll tell him, she thought. When it's time. All of it. The whole impossible truth of what I am and where I came from, and whose life I fell into, and what I have tried to make of it. I'll tell him. And then we'll see. She learned his rhythms the way she learned everything, by observation, by pattern, by the slow accumulation of data points, until a picture emerged that was more reliable than any single impression. He woke before the camp. She knew this because she also woke before the camp, an old habit, built in the first year in the hut when the early hours were the only quiet ones she had. She would come out of her tent in the gray pre-dawn, and find the command tent already lit, a shadow moving behind the canvas. They would go about their mornings without comment, yet there was something in that shared early silence that felt like a secret, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. He ate the same meal every morning. Hard bread, dried meat, whatever fruit was available. Fast, functional. The meal of a man who had never learned to think of food as anything more than fuel. She started leaving things on the supply table outside the medical tent. Not for him specifically. She would have been mortified to be caught in something so transparent, but available. A small pot of something preserved and sweet. Dried figs. Once, a flat cake she had made with the camp baker that tasted like a memory of home. He never mentioned it. But the things disappeared, and she felt the small, sharp satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis had been proven. Ren discovered Thorne on a Tuesday. Ren at 4 years old was aggressively aware of his surroundings. He knew the names of the soldiers, had opinions on the medics, and had befriended the camp dog. But he had been keeping a specific distance from Thorne, an instinct she respected. On this Tuesday, she was treating a soldier's fracture when she heard a voice outside. What are you making? Thorne's voice was lower when directed at a child, a rumble that skipped across her nerves. She kept her hand steady on the soldier's arm. A map. Ren's voice drifted in, clear and considering. Of what? The camp. But also the distances between things, because the medical tent is too far from the command tent. If someone gets hurt in the night near command, they have too far to go. Silence followed. She was acutely aware of the soldier under her hands, trying very hard to appear deaf. That's a reasonable observation, Thorne said. There was a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before. Something tentative, almost tender. I told her, Ren said. She said she'd already noted it. She had, Thorne replied. It's on the list for the next camp configuration. You look at me sometimes, Ren said with a directness that made her breath hitch. You look at me like you're trying to work something out. The silence stretched. You're observant, Thorne said carefully. She taught me to be. I don't mind the looking. I just wanted you to know I noticed. She finished the bandage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard Thorne move away, and Ren returned to his drawing. She looked at the soldier, who was staring at the ceiling. Thank you for your patience, she said, her voice sounding far away to her own ears. 3 weeks in, she saved a man Thorne cared about. Kale, a senior officer from Thorne's original unit, was brought in with a wound the attending medic had dismissed as superficial. She found the internal bleeding by touch in the middle of the night, recognizing the specific, sickly pallor of a man losing his life from the inside out. She worked for 2 hours, her hands slick with blood, her focus narrowed down to the pulse under her fingertips. She didn't send for help. She didn't need it. Kale lived. Thorne came to the medical tent at first light. She was cleaning up, her hair beginning to escape its locks, her skin smelling of iron and sage. He stood in the entrance, his presence filling the space until the air felt thin. The medic assessed it as superficial, he said, his eyes scanning her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. The medic was wrong. I checked. Kale has been with me since the 2nd year, he said. It wasn't information, it was a confession. I know. He talks about you the way soldiers talk about officers they'd die for. Something moved in his face, a softening of the jaw, a darkening of his gaze. You should sleep, he said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that sent a shiver down her spine. I will. Now. It was an order, but the heat in his eyes told her it was also a plea. She looked at him, and for a second, the distance between them evaporated. The scent of him, leather, cold air, and something uniquely masculine, seemed to wrap around her. Yes, General, she said softly. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was an opening. When she woke 3 hours later, there was a cup of tea outside her tent and a piece of warm bread. She counted that as a victory. The incident with the supply officer, Forster, happened on a gray Wednesday. Forster was a man who loved the word no. He withheld a shipment of compounds she needed for a dying soldier, hiding behind proper channels. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She walked to his desk with a cold, clarifying anger. I'd like you to come with me, now. To the medical tent. I want you to look at the man who is dying while you check your paperwork. Forster supplied the allocation. She found out later that Forster had tried to complain to Thorne about her insubordination. What did the general say? She asked Kale later. Said that if she identified an obstruction to patient care, she was doing her job. And if the paperwork came across his desk again, Forster would be the one explaining himself. He hadn't spoken to her about it. He hadn't required her to thank him. He had simply handled it, protecting her space with the same quiet ferocity he used to lead his army. It was a specific kind of respect that felt more intimate than any compliment. She had a policy of never lying to Ren. He was too smart, his father's son, in every way that mattered. He came to her on a Thursday evening, sitting on the workbench as she ground herbs into a fine, aromatic powder. Is General Bolton my father? He asked. The pestle slowed. She had been preparing for this for 5 weeks. Yes, she said. Ren absorbed this. Does he know? I think he suspects. I need to tell him properly. It's a complicated story. Is the hard part about how you're not really from here? She went completely still. The air in the tent suddenly cold. You know about that. I've known for a while. You know things you shouldn't. You talk to yourself in a different language. He looked at her with his father's intense, searching eyes. I think you should tell him soon. He looks at you the same way he looks at me. Like he's trying to find where he fits. She laughed, a short, helpless sound. I'll take it under advisement. She found out about the shoulder by accident. 6 weeks in, after a skirmish, she passed the command tent and heard a sharp, hissed intake of breath, the sound of a man fighting his own body. She pushed the flap open without thinking. What's wrong with your shoulder? Thorne was sitting at his table, his left hand braced, his right hand gripping his shoulder. He looked up, his expression a flicker of surprise before the granite mask slammed back down. It's old, he said. It flares. 7 years old, she guessed, remembering the memories of the boy in the woods. Let me look at it. It doesn't require. Sit forward, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. He sat forward. She moved behind him, her hands reaching out to touch him for the first time. The heat of his skin was startling, radiating through his thin shirt. She found the joint, her fingers pressing into the hard muscle of his back. He was incredibly tense, his body a coiled spring. As she worked, her thumbs finding the center of the inflammation, he let out a long, shuddering breath. It wasn't a sound of pain, it was a sound of surrender. Her heart hammered in her throat. Being this close to him was like standing near a furnace. She could see the pulse in his neck, the way his hair curled at the nape. I can make something for this, she whispered, her voice slightly breathless. You shouldn't be managing this with willpower alone. Willpower is reliable, he rumbled. So am I, she countered. She felt the shift in him, a fractional leaning back into her touch. She was acutely aware of the warmth of him, of the specific, heavy silence that had stretched between them for 6 weeks. Her skin hummed with the proximity. She stepped back, the loss of contact feeling like a physical ache. I'll have a compound ready by tomorrow. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. This close, the hairline seam in his granite exterior was a wide, gaping crack. His eyes were molten, dark with a hunger he wasn't quite hiding anymore. Why are you? He started, then stopped. You can ask, she said, her heart doing a frantic dance. You're not what I thought you were, he said quietly. I thought you came for an advantage. An angle. I came for stability for my son, she said, holding his gaze. There is no angle. There never was. He looked at her with a raw honesty that stripped her bare. I know that now. The silence held something new. A spark that had finally caught flame. She picked up her kit, her hands trembling just enough to notice. Tomorrow morning, she said. For the shoulder. He nodded once. She walked back through the camp, the cold air biting at her cheeks, but her body was still burning from the touch of him. Ren was right. He was ready. The only question left was whether she was brave enough to meet him in the fire. She knew something was wrong before the briefing. She had learned, in 7 weeks of camp life, to read the specific atmosphere of a military installation the way she read a patient, by the small signs, the things that were slightly off from baseline, the details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The way the senior soldiers moved that morning had a different quality to it. Faster but more contained. The particular economy of motion that belonged to people who had been told something and were now quietly, professionally preparing. She finished her morning rounds without comment, made sure her medical supplies were organized for mobile deployment rather than static use, and told Ren that today he was going to stay with the camp baker, who had become, over the weeks, something between a minder and an indulgent uncle. Ren looked at her with his father's eyes. How bad? He said. I don't know yet, she said. Probably fine. But I want you here. He held her gaze for a moment with an oldness that still, sometimes, caught her off guard. Then he nodded. Come back, he said. Simply, directly, in the way he said important things, without decoration, as though the weight of them was sufficient, and additional words would only dilute it. Always, she said. She kissed his forehead and picked up her kit. She went to find Thorn. He was outside the command tent with his senior officers, maps in hand, and he looked up when she approached with an expression that was already reconfiguring itself into professional distance before he had quite finished the look. Medical deployment, she said, before he could speak. I need to know the expected casualty profile and where you want the forward station. A beat. Then he showed her the map. The operation was a push on a fortified position 2 miles east. Intelligence suggested a smaller force than they had faced in the main campaign, a remnant unit that had been causing supply line problems. It was supposed to be manageable. It was supposed to be brief. She looked at the map. She looked at the terrain. She thought about what she knew of fortified positions, and the specific way that smaller forces in desperate circumstances fought differently from larger ones, with less strategy and more ferocity, because they had nothing left to calculate. She did not say this. It was not her domain. But she positioned her forward station, where she would have positioned it if she had expected the casualty count to be higher than the intelligence suggested. She made sure she had everything she would need for the kind of wounds that came from close quarters fighting, and she went over her supply inventory one additional time. Thorn watched her do all of this. He said nothing, but she saw him speak quietly to one of his officers, and the officer moved 2 additional medics to her station. She thought. He saw the same thing in the map that I did. He caught her eye once, briefly, before he moved out with the main force. There was something in it that was neither professional nor personal, but occupied the exact space between them that had been accumulating for 7 weeks. The thing that was not yet named, that had been standing in the light since the night of the shoulder, patient and present. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded once. He nodded back. He rode out. She set up her station. She waited. The intelligence had been wrong. Not catastrophically, they did not lose the position, but the remnant force was nearly twice what had been estimated, and they had fortified more effectively than anyone had anticipated. What was supposed to be a brief, manageable engagement became something longer and harder and considerably more costly than the briefing had implied. The casualties came in waves. She worked. That was all there was. Work. And the specific tunnel that forms around a person in a crisis when the mind and body contract to exactly the size of the immediate problem. She had trained for this, in a different world, in a different lifetime, in a curriculum that had not anticipated medieval warfare, but had taught her enough about triage and treatment, and the fierce, unglamorous necessity of keeping people alive, that she found she had more preparation than the situation might have seemed to warrant. She did not think about Thorn. She could not afford to think about Thorn. She filed him in a part of her mind she did not access while her hands were needed elsewhere, and she worked. It was Kale who told her, in the middle of the 4th hour, with a controlled blankness in his face that she recognized as the expression soldiers wore when they were delivering news they needed to not feel while delivering it. The general took an arrow, he said. Right side. He still mounted, but she was already moving. He was at the edge of the field position, still on his horse, because getting off his horse would have meant conceding something he was not prepared to concede, which she understood and found simultaneously admirable and completely maddening. The arrow had been broken off. Someone with field sense had done that much. but the head was still in, and he had been fighting on it for what looked, from the pallor underneath his dark skin and the particular set of his jaw, like at least an hour. Get down, she said. The position isn't. Kale has the position, she said. Get down. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the full force of everything she had. The competence, the certainty, the 7 weeks of building something between them that meant he knew, when she used this voice, that she was not performing authority, but exercising it from the only place it mattered, which was genuine knowledge of the situation. He got down. She caught most of his weight and was surprised briefly by how much of it there was. He was solid with muscle and armor and the dense, particular heaviness of a large man, allowing himself to stop holding himself up. Lean on me, she said. I'm fine, he said, which was so obviously untrue that she did not dignify it with a response. She got him to the station. She got the armor off. She looked at what the arrow had done. It had missed the lung, which was the first and most important piece of information. It had not missed everything else. There was significant tissue damage, and he had lost more blood than was comfortable, and the arrowhead had to come out cleanly, or the next 12 hours were going to be very difficult. She worked. She was aware of him watching her face while she worked, with an intensity that she could feel at the edge of her concentration, but did not engage with, because she could not afford to engage with it yet. This is going to hurt, she said for the arrowhead. Everything hurts, he said. Do it. She did it. He made no sound at all, which told her more about what he was made of than anything she had witnessed in 7 weeks of watching him command. She packed and bound the wound with hands that did not shake, which cost her something she would account for later when she was alone. When it was done, he lay back against the station frame in the gray afternoon light, and she sat beside him and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 hours, to breathe. You're going to be fine, she said. The lung is clear. You need to rest for 2 weeks, which I know you won't do, so I'm revising my request to 10 days and anticipating a negotiation. Something moved in his face. 8, he said. 9, she said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued. The almost smile that she had come to understand was his equivalent of a full one. 9, he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the camp was winding down from the day's work, the specific exhaustion of an engagement concluded. Men moving with the weighted relief of people who had come through something and were not yet ready to process it. His hand, resting on the ground between them, moved. Not much. Just slightly toward her. Not touching. Just close. Deliberate. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was watching her with the walls down in a way she had not seen before, because she had not seen the walls actually down until now. Had seen them cracked, had seen the seams, but not this. Not the face behind all of it. He looked tired. He looked real. He looked, she thought, like the boy in the borrowed memories, and the man he had built himself into, and all the years between, laid out plainly, without armor. She put her hand next to his, not over it, just next to it, touching at the edge. He closed his eyes. She sat beside him in the fading afternoon light, and held the edge of his hand and let him rest. The camp was quiet by the time she had resettled him in the command tent. The rest of the wounded attended to, Ren retrieved from the baker, and put to bed with the minimum of explanation that his age and his intelligence would accept. She came back. She had told herself she would wait, for the right time, for the right conditions, for the circumstances that would make the conversation easier. She had been telling herself this for 7 weeks. She recognized it now, sitting in the entrance of the command tent, with the night outside and the lamp burning low within, for what it actually was. Not strategy, not patience, fear, not of him, not of his reaction in the simple sense. Fear of the particular vulnerability of telling someone the whole truth about yourself and watching them decide what to do with it. She had built her life in this world on competence and reliability and the slow accumulation of trust, and all of those things would hold or they would not hold, and she could not know which until she said what needed to be said. She went in. He was propped against the camp chair, bandaged, pale, considerably more human-looking than he ever permitted himself to appear in daylight hours. He looked up when she entered. Ren is asleep, she said. Good, he said. She sat in the chair across the map table. The maps were still there between them. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at him. I need to tell you something, she said. Several things. They're connected, and they require telling in a specific order, or none of it will make sense. I need you to let me get through it before you respond. He looked at her. All right, he said. She took a breath. Ren is your son, she said. You know that. I think you've known it since the first week, or suspected it with enough certainty that the distinction didn't matter. He is yours, biologically, without question. He was born 7 weeks after you left the village. Something moved in his face, but he held to the agreement and said nothing. The woman who was pregnant when you left, she said, died in labor. She died alone, in your hut, on the night Ren was born. She had been living there on the coins you left. She hadn't spent them. I don't fully understand why, except that I think spending them meant something she wasn't ready to accept. She paused. She died. And I came instead. The silence was very still. I'm not her, she said. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think part of you has been trying to reconcile who I am now with who she was, and they don't reconcile because we are not the same person. I am not the woman who said those things in the square. I am not the woman who shrugged off your proposal and was already spoken for and didn't tell you. I am not the woman who called you. She stopped. I know what she said. I have her memories. I know exactly what she said, and I know you heard it, and I have carried the weight of it for 5 years on behalf of a woman I never was, because it was the shape I was given when I arrived here, and I thought I owed it to her to carry it. His hands on the arms of the chair were very still. I came from another world, she said. A different place entirely, different century, different everything. I was a student of plant medicine. I died in an accident, and I woke up in your hut in the middle of labor, and I delivered your son alone, and I have been here ever since. 5 years. Building a life in a world I didn't come from, raising a child I didn't birth, carrying a face that belonged to someone else until it became mine by virtue of time and use. She held his gaze. I am telling you this because you deserve the truth of it, because you looked at me that night, the shoulder, the conversation, with something real, and I will not let you give something real to a version of me that isn't complete. And because Ren told me, with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has decided something, that you were ready, and I have learned, she said, with a quality in her voice that was not quite steady but was something close to it, to trust his judgment. She stopped, she waited. The silence was the longest of her life in any world. He sat with it. She watched him sit with it, watched it move through him in layers, the way a stone dropped in deep water displaces the column above it all the way to the surface. His face was not blank. She had learned to read it well enough to know that what looked like blankness was actually the processing of someone who thought carefully and at depth before they spoke, who had learned to distrust rapid conclusions, because rapid conclusions had cost him things he could not get back. She waited. She had told the truth. It was out of her hands now. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. She died, he said, not a question. Confirming. Yes. In my hut. Yes. He looked at the table for a moment. I didn't know, he said. About the child. I didn't know until I saw him. A pause. When I saw him, I thought, he stopped. I thought she had come to. He shook his head. It doesn't matter what I thought. It matters, she said. He looked at her. I thought you had come to trade on it, he said. On his face. On what it meant. I thought it was a move. I know you thought that. I was wrong. Yes. He held her gaze. You kept his disc, he said. She blinked. It was not what she had expected. Yes. 5 years. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face was doing something complicated that she did not try to categorize. It was too many things at once, and she had learned not to force his expressions into single meanings. She left him in that hut for 3 months, he said quietly, not with anger, with the flatness of a man stating the dimensions of a wound he had already mapped. Alone. With those coins. And she was frightened, she said. I'm not defending it, but she was 19 and alone, and her family had expelled her, and I think by the end she knew that she had made choices she couldn't take back. And she ran out of time before she could figure out what to do with that knowledge. A pause. She didn't survive it. I did. I want to be careful not to. She searched for the word. Not to speak badly of her. She suffered for what she did, more than she should have. He looked at her for a long moment. You're defending her, he said. The woman who, I know what she did, she said. I'm not defending it. I'm trying to be accurate. She was not a villain. She was a young woman who was careless with something precious, and then paid for it in the way that careless young women have always paid, which is entirely, and without mercy. A beat. You paid too. That's not nothing. I'm not asking you to forgive something that wasn't done to me. I'm just telling you that she was more than the worst moment of her. He was quiet. You're nothing like what I expected, he said at last. It was the same thing he had said weeks ago in the medical tent, but it carried different weight now, informed by everything that had come since. I know, she said. From another world. Yes, that should be, he paused. That should be an impossible thing to believe. I know. And yet, he looked at her with something in his face that was open in a way she had not seen, and which made her chest ache with the specific pain of witnessing something that has been closed for a long time allowing itself, carefully, to open. The change is too complete. I have been trying to explain it for 7 weeks, and there is no explanation that covers it. You know things you should not know. You think in a way that belongs to somewhere else. A pause. You loved him before you had any reason to. Ren. From the beginning. I could see it. It wasn't performance, it wasn't. He stopped. A woman who had come to trade on his face would not look at him the way you look at him. No, she said softly. She wouldn't. He looked at her in the lamplight for a long time. She let him look. She had nothing left to hide. I have a son, he said slowly, as though the sentence was new, as though he was learning its weight for the first time. You have a son, she said. He's 4 years old. He maps things and asks approximately 40 questions before breakfast, and he already knows more about medicinal plants than the healer who's been treating your army for 8 years. He has your jaw and your stubbornness and a quality of attention that I think he gets from both of us. She paused. He told me tonight to come here. He said you were ready. Something broke across Thorne's face that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, and was more real than anything she had seen on it. He's 4, he said. He's precocious, she said. The sound he made was unexpected. A short, genuine, involuntary breath of a laugh that arrived before he could manage it, and which he did not try to take back. She felt it land in her chest like the first warm day after a long winter, like something returning from somewhere far away. He asked her to stay, not in the way of someone making a declaration. He was not a man built for declarations. She understood that, and she did not need him to be. He asked her the way he asked for things he actually needed, directly, without performance, with the specific vulnerability of a person for whom asking had always been harder than doing. I don't want you to leave, he said. When the posting ends. I don't want, he stopped. Started again. I want to know him, properly. And I want, another stop. She waited. I want to know you. The real you. Not the posting, not the camp, the version of you that has been here for 5 years, building something from nothing, in a world that wasn't yours. That version of me is this version of me, she said. There's only one. I know, he said. That's what I want. She looked at him in the lamplight. This man she had known secondhand for 5 years and directly for 7 weeks, who had built himself from nothing with no one watching, who had been hurt in the specific way that only happens when you love something more than it loves you back, and who had kept going anyway, who had learned fairness from being treated unfairly, and gentleness from having none of it extended to him, who had looked at her for 7 weeks with walls up and eyes that betrayed him anyway. I'm not easy, she said. I have opinions about everything. I will rearrange your medical stores without asking and argue with your supply officers, and teach your son things that will make everyone around him mildly exhausted. I know, he said. I come from somewhere you will never be able to fully understand. I know that too, and I'm not her, she said one last time, needing it said one last time. I will never be her. I can't give you back what she was to you before it broke. He held her gaze. I don't want her back, he said, with a quiet, absolute clarity that she felt in her bones. I want what's here. She let out a breath. She crossed the space between them, not far. It had never been far. The distance between them had been collapsing for weeks, and what remained was more symbolic than actual. And she sat beside him, close, and he turned his head and looked at her from a proximity that was new, and which neither of them moved to increase or diminish. They sat in the lamplight with the night outside and the camp breathing its slow, exhausted breath around them, and Ren asleep in his tent, dreaming whatever 4-year-olds dream, when they have decided the adults in their lives have finally sorted themselves out. I have a question, he said after a while. Yes? In your world. A pause. Did you know that plants could do what they do? Did you always know? She thought about it. About a girl in a lecture hall, years and a world away, who had chosen an obscure and underfunded specialty, because the intersection of living things and healing had seemed to her like the most fundamental work there was, who had died on a Tuesday, with her earphones in, still learning. Yes, she said. Always. Good, he said quietly. It's a good thing to have always known. She looked at his profile in the lamplight. She thought about the wooden disc against her sternum, the initial worn smooth, the circle of leaves around it. She thought about the 14 gold coins that had become her life. She thought about Ren, asleep, who had arrived in the world under impossible circumstances and had turned out to be the best thing in it. She thought, I was supposed to graduate on a Saturday. I was supposed to have a different life entirely, neat and planned and held in hands I knew. Instead I have this. She reached over and took his hand, properly, fully, fingers interlaced, and felt him hold it without hesitation, without calculation, with the steady, unperforming certainty of a man who had decided something and did not intend to revisit it. Outside, the camp was quiet. The fire in the brazier had burned down to embers, still warm, still giving light, the particular patient glow of something that has lasted through the long dark and has no intention of going out. Instead I have this, she thought again. And it is more than enough. And so we reach the final embers of Roots and Embers. From the first confusing breath in a dark hut to this quiet, hard-earned peace in the command tent, it has been an incredible journey following its path through a world that was never meant to be hers. This story has always been about more than just surviving. It was about the roots we plant when we think we're just passing through, and the embers of old lives that eventually light the way home. Thank you so much for being part of this narrative from the very beginning. Your support and engagement are what keep these stories breathing. If you've loved seeing this family find their way back to one another, please make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good slow burn, and subscribe to the channel so you're right there with us when the next story begins. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on the journey of Thorn, Ren, and our herbalist. Until the next story begins, keep the light burning.